The smoke from the gunshots still clung to the air, thick and metallic, a shroud over the dead. He walked through the carnage, his boots sticky with blood and dust. A wagon, burned to its axles, smoldered nearby. That's where he found her. She was just a girl, crouched low, a rifle that was far too big for her resting across her lap. Her hands trembled, but her eyes, wide and hollow, were fixed on the bodies scattered across the canyon floor. Men, women, children. It made no difference to the killers. They were all cut down, left in the dirt like slaughtered cattle. He didn't know her name. He didn't care. He saw a survivor, and that was enough for now. He held out a hand, his voice rough but steady. "It's over," he said. "You're safe now." She looked up at him, her gaze empty, a window into a soul that had seen too much. And that's when his world stopped, not because of the horror in her eyes, but because of what hung around her neck. A worn leather cord, a silver locket, cracked right down the middle. It couldn't be. He had made that locket himself, carved it for his wife, Clara, and he had placed it around her neck 5 winters ago, just before he lowered her into the cold, hard ground. His hand dropped to his side, the air caught in his throat, sharp as a knife. "No," he whispered, the words stolen by the wind. It wasn't possible. It was a ghost, a trick of the light. The girl flinched at his tone. "What? What is it?" But he wasn't looking at her anymore. He was staring at the locket, staring at the ghost of his wife. The wind howled through the canyon, a mournful cry that sounded like it remembered everything. They called it a raid 5 years ago, an accident. Wrong place, wrong time. That's what the law had said. But that locket was made only once, for Clara. And now it hung from a stranger's neck, slick with ash and blood, telling him a story he never wanted to hear. The story that everything he thought he knew about his wife's death was a lie. Dust had a way of settling on everything in the town of Dry Creek. It coated the rooftops, filled the cracks in the boardwalk, and settled deep in the lungs of folks born into a world of grit and silence. It stuck to grief like a second skin, a permanent layer that no amount of rain could ever wash away. The town itself was a testament to decay, a single crooked street flanked by sagging buildings, a saloon that smelled of stale beer and regret, and a church whose bell hadn't rung in years. On the very edge of this forgotten place, in a house that might have once been blue, lived a woman named Eva. The paint had long since surrendered to the sun, peeling away to reveal the weathered gray wood beneath. A single rocking chair sat on the porch, swaying in the breeze as if an invisible ghost was still waiting there. That ghost's name was Clara before she was gone. Now the house belonged to Eva, but nobody in town called her Eva anymore. To them, she was the widow, or that poor thing. On crueler tongues, she was simply the jinx. They said she was a magnet for misery. First, the fire that claimed her husband, leaving nothing but a scorched patch of earth where the barn used to be. Then, the fever that stole her only child. And after that, the silence. Not the quiet kind, but the heavy, suffocating kind that comes when people turn their backs on you. No one visited her porch. No pies were left to cool on her windowsill. In the general store, conversations would die the moment she limped through the door. Even the preacher, a man paid to speak of forgiveness, would look right through her during his sermons, his blessings never quite reaching her lonely pew. A thin, pale scar that ran from the corner of her mouth to just below her ear told part of her story. But her limp told the rest. A dragging right foot, a leg stiff with a memory she could never escape. The townsfolk filled in the blanks with their own dark tales. Some whispered she'd made a pact with devils in the hills after the fire. Others swore she could still hear her dead husband calling her name on the wind. The children, bold in their ignorance, would dare each other to throw rocks at her gate, shouting, "Witch!" before scrambling away into the dusty streets. But the truth was far stranger and far more silent. Ava hadn't spoken a full sentence in 3 years, not since the day she found her husband's boots standing upright outside the burned-out barn, still filled with his blood. The sheriff, a man named Toiver, had shrugged and said it was wolves. But wolves don't steal a man's locket. Wolves don't leave hoofprints in a perfect circle around a body, and wolves don't whisper your name in your dreams, calling to you from beyond the grave. Every morning, Ava waited for a sign, for a message, for anything that might explain the gnawing emptiness in her life. Most days, all she got was the wind and the company of her old horse, Dusty, who seemed just as weary as she was. She knew she wasn't welcome in Dry Creek. She was a ghost, haunting the edges of their lives, a reminder of all the things they wanted to forget. She had accepted her fate, her silence, her solitude, until the day the stranger arrived, and everything she thought she knew was about to be burned to the ground. Riders rarely came through Dry Creek, and those who did were usually gone by sunset, eager to leave the town's oppressive silence behind them. But this one was different. He rode in slow, his tall frame cloaked in a long, dark coat that he wore like a suit of armor. A weather-beaten hat shadowed his face, hiding his eyes but not the grim set of his jaw. He wasn't in a hurry to be anywhere, yet he moved with a purpose that made the whole town uneasy. The men in the saloon watched him over the rims of their glasses. They said he didn't drink, he just observed, his eyes tracking every person who walked by as if he were weighing their souls and finding them wanting. Rumors spread through the town like a prairie fire. "He's a bounty hunter," one ranch hand muttered. "Got outlaw blood, I can see it," whispered another. One man even swore he saw the glint of a U.S. Marshal's badge under the stranger's coat, but nobody was brave enough to ask. Ava saw him first from her fence line. He rode past her property without a glance, his focus fixed on the crooked street ahead. No one ever looked at her, so that wasn't unusual. But there was something in the way he sat in the saddle, a coiled stillness, that made her back away from the fence and retreat into the shadows of her house. She bolted the door and lit a lamp, even though the sun was still high in the sky. An unnamed fear, cold and sharp, had pricked her skin. She tried to put him out of her mind. She had her silence, her porch, her ghosts. She didn't need any new ones, but her fragile peace was shattered 3 nights later. It started with the necklace. She found it hanging on her front gatepost, catching the last rays of the dying sun. A silver locket, old and tarnished, with a deep crack running right down the center. Her breath hitched in her chest. Her hands began to tremble uncontrollably. It was her husband's locket, the one she had placed in his coffin with her own 2 hands. Who had done this? Who had desecrated his grave? With shaking fingers, she pried the locket open. It was empty. No picture, no lock of hair, just the cold, metallic scent of something long dead. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in years, but her knees gave out from under her, and she sank to the dusty ground, the locket clutched in her fist. Who knew it was missing? And more importantly, who wanted her to know? The stranger's face flashed in her mind. It had to be him. This wasn't a random act. It was a message. The next morning, for the first time in months, she walked into town. The whispers followed her like hungry dogs. A hush fell over the general store as she entered. Mr. Callahan, the proprietor who used to bring her stew on Sundays after her husband died, now refused to meet her eye. She ignored them all. She bought matches, coffee, and a single heavy bullet for her old hunting rifle. The clerk raised a suspicious eyebrow. "Expecting company, Eva?" She didn't answer. She just paid her coin and turned to leave. As she stepped back out into the harsh sunlight, she saw him, the stranger. He was leaning against a post outside the saloon, a thin cigarillo dangling from his lips. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, flicked to hers for just a second. and for the first time in 3 long years, Eva felt seen. But what she saw in his gaze wasn't pity or kindness. It was something far more terrifying. It was recognition. The wind changed that morning. It blew hard from the north, carrying a bitter chill that had no place in the heart of spring. It kicked up the dust, turning the sky a hazy, ominous brown. The crows that usually lined her fence sat silent and still, like black omens waiting for the world to end. Eva stepped off her porch, the familiar ache in her right leg a dull throb in the cold air. She scanned the horizon, her eyes searching for movement. Nothing. And then she saw him. The stranger. He was standing by the old abandoned telegraph office, his arms crossed over his chest. He wasn't smoking this time. He was just watching. Not the town. Not the road. Her. Most men looked away when they saw her, their gazes sliding past as if she were invisible. This one didn't. His stare was direct, intense, and it made her heart pound against her ribs like a trapped bird. She quickly looked away, retreating to the familiar routine of her chores. She fed Dusty, braided her hair tight, and sat on her porch with the old hunting rifle across her knees. She didn't plan to use it. She just needed the cold weight of the steel in her hands, a reminder of the person she used to be before her world had turned to ash. That evening, he came closer. He was standing at her gate, one hand resting on the latch but making no move to open it. The sun bled across the sky, casting long, distorted shadows between them. The silence stretched out, tight and heavy as a drawn gun. She met his gaze without flinching, her own silence a shield she had perfected over the years. Finally, her voice, raspy from disuse, broke the quiet. "You're standing mighty close to a place folks don't go near." His voice was low and even, the sound of gravel rolling downhill. "Figured I'd be safer here than in town." "Not many figure that," she replied, a hint of steel in her tone. "I'm not most men." He let the silence settle again, comfortable in it, like a man used to outlasting ghosts. After a long moment, she spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "You left something." His brow lifted slightly. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the necklace. She held it up, the cracked silver locket dangling from her fingers like a broken promise. He didn't flinch. He didn't reach for it. He just shook his head slowly. "It ain't mine," he said. "I buried this with my husband," she shot back, her voice trembling with a rage she hadn't felt in years. His gaze softened, but only for a second. "That man must have been loved." Her jaw tightened. He was. She waited for the lie, the smirk, the twist of the truth that always came from men. But he offered none. There was only the look in his storm-gray eyes, a look that held a grief so profound, so familiar, it felt like looking into a mirror. He tipped his hat, turned without another word, and walked back toward the saloon, his long coat swirling around his heels. He never looked back. Eva stood there for a long time, the locket burning a cold spot in her palm. 1,000 questions screamed in her mind. If he hadn't left it, who had? And what scared her more, that he had brought the locket back from the dead, or that he hadn't? One thing was certain. The fragile piece of her isolated world had been shattered forever. By the middle of the week, the atmosphere in Dry Creek had curdled. The nervous whispers that used to follow Eva had grown louder, sharper. The preacher started locking the church doors an hour earlier each evening, and Sheriff Toiver, a man who usually moved with the lazy pace of a sleepy hound, now walked with his hand resting on the grip of his pistol. He cornered her on the street as she was leaving the general store, his posture uncharacteristically tense. "You seen him around?" he asked, his eyes darting around as if expecting trouble to leap from the shadows. "I've seen lots of things, Sheriff," she answered, her voice flat. Toiver's face tightened. A man like that, he brings trouble with him. He ain't just passing through. Neither am I, she said, her gaze unwavering. He studied her for a moment, a strange look in his eyes. You still sore over how things ended with your husband? The question was a slap in the face. She just stared at him, a long, cold, silent stare, until he shifted uncomfortably and backed away. She knew what he was doing. He was trying to remind her of her place, to put her back in the box of the grieving, broken widow. But something had shifted inside her. The fear was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. Anger. That night, the stranger came back. He didn't stop at the gate this time. He walked right up onto her porch and sat in the second rocking chair, the one that had been empty for 3 years. He moved as if he belonged there, as if he had been invited. They sat in silence, two solitary figures watching the moon rise over the dark, sleeping town. After what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice a low rumble in the quiet. You've got the look of someone who's been waiting on justice for a long time. She didn't answer. She just kept her eyes on the horizon. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Tell me something, ma'am. When a man dies and the law decides it ain't worth their time, what's a widow supposed to do? Ava turned her head and looked at him then, truly looked at him for the first time. In the pale moonlight, she could see the lines etched around his eyes, the weary set of his mouth. He wasn't just a stranger anymore. He was a reflection of her own pain. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was clear and steady, without a trace of a shake. She remembers, Ava said, and then she waits. For what? He asked, his gaze locked on hers. For a reason to stop waiting. Just then, another sound cut through the night, a sound that made the hairs on her neck stand on end. Hoofbeats, fast and hard. 5 riders, their faces masked by bandanas and grime, thundered into town just as the first light of dawn touched the sky. They rode with a reckless arrogance, their horses kicking up clouds of dust. No flags, no words, just a palpable wave of menace that washed over the silent street. The storm she had been waiting for hadn't just arrived. It had come with a name, and it was riding straight for them. The 5 riders were like a plague descending upon Dry Creek. They moved with a swaggering, violent confidence that sucked the air out of the town. Within an hour, they had taken over the saloon, throwing a drunk ranch hand through the swinging doors just to prove they could. One of them, a man with a wild laugh and crueler eyes, fired his pistol into the sky, the sound echoing off the silent buildings like a death knell. The townsfolk vanished. Doors were bolted, windows shuttered. The crooked street, usually just quiet, was now deathly still. But the stranger, the man who now sat on Eva's porch every night, didn't move. He sat alone at a table under the saloon's overhang, sipping a glass of water, his eyes hidden by the brim of his hat. He was watching, waiting. Eva had to go into town to see the blacksmith. Dusty had thrown a shoe, and she couldn't put it off any longer. As she limped down the main street, her head held high, all 5 of the riders turned to stare at her. Their eyes crawled over her, filled with a greasy, predatory hunger. She didn't flinch, didn't break her stride. She had endured the stares of the entire town for 3 years. These men were nothing new. But then, something happened. The stranger stood up. It wasn't a fast or aggressive movement. He simply rose from his chair, a silent, towering presence. He didn't look at her. He looked at them. The riders paused, their leering smiles fading. For a long, breathless moment, it was just them and the stranger. A silent standoff between 2 packs of wolves. One of the riders, the one who seemed to be their leader, finally broke the tension. He gave a lazy, mocking smile and tipped his hat to the stranger. "We'll be seeing you," he said, his voice a low threat. The stranger didn't even blink. "Not if I see you first," That night, he was back in the rocking chair on her porch, the setting sun casting his face in shadow. The air between them was thick with unspoken questions. "You know them?" she finally asked, her voice quiet. "Not yet," he replied. "But they know you," she stated. It wasn't a question. He gave a slow nod. "They're looking for something." She paused, her heart beating a little faster. "Or someone?" He turned to look at her then, his gray eyes piercing the twilight. "Someone," he confirmed, "dead or alive." A chill ran down her spine. "And which is it?" He stared out at the darkening plains for a long moment before answering. "Dead," he said softly, "but they just don't know it yet." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't empty or awkward. It was heavy, charged with a terrifying new reality. The men in town weren't just random thugs. They were here for a reason tied to the stranger, to the locket, and somehow, to her. For the first time in 3 years, Eva didn't feel alone on her porch. She didn't trust this man, not yet. But trust wasn't what she needed. She needed the truth. And she had a sinking feeling that the truth was about to get them both killed. The whispers in Dry Creek had always been cruel, but now they turned venomous. By the end of the week, someone had nailed a crude drawing to the heavy oak door of the church. It depicted a woman with a vicious scar and a twisted leg, her hands stretched out toward a man with no face. Scrawled underneath in what looked like red ink were 2 words: "Witch's widow." Beneath that, a warning: "Death follows her." Ava didn't have to guess who it was meant for. The entire town knew. Sheriff Toiver tore it down before the sun was fully up, his face a mask of grim frustration. But it was too late. The poison had already seeped into the town's bloodstream. The change was immediate and brutal. Mothers would physically pull their children to the other side of the street when they saw her coming. Shopkeepers who had once offered her grudging service now stiffened the moment she walked in. Mr. Callahan, the owner of the general store, finally said the words out loud. "You're not welcome here anymore, Ava. You bring too much trouble." Ava just stared at him, her eyes burning. "Trouble was here long before I was," she said, her voice low and steady. It didn't matter. The door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing her complete and utter banishment. She tried to stay away, to retreat back into her self-imposed exile, but Dusty had gone lame. A swelling in his back leg needed ointment, and the only person in town who sold it was Old May, the woman who ran the livery stable. With a heavy heart and a sack in her hand, Eva limped through the hostile streets. She almost made it. She was just past the saloon when a stone flew from the shadows of an alleyway. It struck her hard in the back, sending a jolt of pain up her spine and knocking her forward into the thick, filthy mud of the street. Her head hit the ground, and the scar on her cheek, a constant reminder of past pain, split open. Warm, sticky blood trickled down her chin. Laughter erupted from the alley, a boy's voice, high and cruel. "The witch is cursed! Look at her!" Her hands clenched into white-knuckled fists in the mud. She pushed herself up, her body trembling with a mixture of pain, rage, and profound humiliation. A small crowd had gathered, their faces a mixture of pity, fear, and cruel satisfaction. Some of them were smiling. No one offered a hand. No one said a word. Then Sheriff Toiver stepped out of the saloon. "That's enough," he said, his voice lacking any real authority. He didn't look angry. He looked scared. He just stood there watching as she slowly, painfully pulled herself to her feet and limped away, her forgotten sack lying in the dirt. She made it to the edge of town before the carefully constructed walls around her heart finally crumbled. In the relative privacy of the cottonwood trees, she collapsed. Not with a cry or a dramatic fall, but with a quiet, final surrender. She sank to her knees, the cold, damp earth seeping through her dress. She couldn't breathe. The scar on her face throbbed, a fresh wave of pain with every beat of her heart. For one foolish, fleeting moment, she had allowed herself to hope. The stranger on her porch, the mystery of the locket, the flicker of a shared defiance. She thought it might mean something. She thought her grief might finally have a place to go. But Dry Creek had answered her with a stone to the back and laughter. Snow began to fall, slow, heavy flakes that melted on her skin. A deep, penetrating cold crept into her bones, but she didn't move. Let it take her. Let the world finally forget her name. She closed her eyes, ready for the end, until she heard the sound of boots, slow, careful steps crunching on the frost-bitten grass. She didn't have to look up. She knew who it was. He crouched beside her, a silent shadow in the falling snow. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then he unwrapped the scarf from around his neck and held it out to her. Not forcefully, just offering. Her voice was a cracked whisper when she finally asked, "Why are you here?" "Because no one else is," he said simply. A bitter, broken laugh escaped her lips. "You going to carry me home now, cowboy?" "No," he said softly. "But I'll walk beside you if you try to get up." And he did. She rose slowly, painfully, her face burning with shame and cold. The world felt tilted, unreal. He offered her his arm, and for the first time in her life, she took help from a man she barely knew. She leaned on him, and his strength was a solid, undeniable thing. The walk back to her farm was an eternity of agonizing steps. The pain in her leg flared with each movement, a fiery reminder of her weakness. But he never rushed her. He never spoke. He just matched his pace to her limping stride, his presence a silent, unwavering support. When they finally reached her porch, she expected him to leave her there, to retreat back into the shadows from which he came. But he didn't. He followed her up the steps and sat down in the second rocking chair, the snow melting on the shoulders of his dark coat. She sank into her own chair, the exhaustion so profound it was a physical weight. "You going to tell me who they are now?" she asked, her voice still rough. "The riders." The wind moaned around the corners of the house. His eyes, fixed on the dark shapes of the riders' horses down by the saloon, narrowed. "They're not after you," he said, his voice low. "They're after the man I used to be." She waited, knowing there was more. After a long pause, he continued, his words heavy with the ghosts of his past. "I wore a badge once, for the U.S. Marshals. I watched men hang for their crimes, and I thought I was one of the good ones. Then I made a deal to protect someone I loved, and she died anyway." Eva studied his profile, the hard lines and deep shadows. "Is that why you came to Dry Creek? For them?" "No," he said, turning to face her. His gaze was so intense it felt like it could burn. "I came here because a man I hunted for a year died with your husband's locket in his fist." Her heart stopped beating. The world went silent. All the air left her lungs. You said it wasn't yours." "It wasn't," he confirmed. "I saw him take it off a dead man after a stagecoach robbery. He kept it. A trophy. I think your husband didn't just stumble into some wolves, Eva. I think he died for the wrong man's sins." The silence that descended on the porch then wasn't cold or empty. It was hot, electric, charged with a truth so explosive it threatened to blow her world apart. Her hands, which had been numb with cold, began to shake. But it wasn't with fear this time. It was with rage. A pure, clean, white-hot rage that burned away 3 years of helpless grief. For the first time since she'd found her husband's bloody boots, her sorrow had a face. It had a name. And the man sitting across from her, the stranger who had appeared out of nowhere, was no longer just a shadow. He was the key. He was the first person in 3 years who hadn't just looked at her, but had seen the truth. Later that night, she handed him a cup of tea. It wasn't strong or sweet, just warm. He took it without a word, his large, calloused hands wrapping around the tin cup. She sat across from him, rubbing her aching leg. "You're not here to save me," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," he replied, his eyes meeting hers over the rim of the cup. "I don't think you need saving." A faint, humorless smile touched her lips. "Most men try. Most men are fools," he said. That night, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Ava slept. It wasn't a deep or peaceful sleep, but she didn't wake up screaming. And when she stirred just before dawn, she found a rough wool blanket draped over her shoulders. The fire in the hearth was still glowing with embers. She looked out the window. He was still there, a solitary figure in the rocking chair, watching the road, waiting for what came next. And for the first time, so was she. It began with a fence post, just a single piece of wood, sharp and new, driven deep into the hard-packed earth. He'd brought it from town, along with a hammer and a handful of nails. "Doesn't look like much," he said, his voice rough as he hammered a length of wire to the post. His name was Caleb, he'd finally told her. Just Caleb. Eva brushed a stray curl of hair from her face, a smudge of dirt on her brow. Neither did this town, once. A low chuckle escaped his lips. "Still don't." A small, genuine smile touched her lips, the first one that had reached her eyes in years. They worked through the long spring days, their hands growing calloused, their backs aching. Each new post they set, each rail they nailed into place, each shingle they replaced on the leaking roof felt like an act of quiet defiance. It was a message, sent without words, to the whispering town, to the ghosts in her past, and to the men waiting in the saloon. "We're still here. We're not broken." And for a little while, that felt like enough. The barn came next. It stood like a skeleton on her property, a constant, grim reminder of the fire that had taken her husband. Its collapsed roof and scorched beams were a monument to her grief. She hadn't set foot near it in 3 years. She couldn't. But one morning, she woke to the sound of splintering wood. She found Caleb standing in its shadow, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, a heavy crowbar in his hands. He was prying off the first charred plank. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I know," he answered, and with a grunt of effort, he tore another board free. She watched him for a long moment, then went back to the house, emerging with a hammer of her own. They rebuilt it together, side by side, in a comfortable silence punctuated by the rhythmic sound of their work. They didn't speak of the past. They didn't speak of the future. They just built. And when the structure finally stood tall again, strong and solid and smelling of fresh-cut cedar, he turned to her. The look in his eyes held no pity, no sorrow. It was something else entirely. It was a promise. Their nights were spent by the fire, the flickering light casting dancing shadows on the walls. He told her about his life before the badge, about a farm in Missouri, about a daughter he'd once had, a little girl with eyes as blue as a summer sky. He spoke of the woman he'd loved, the one he couldn't save, the failure that haunted his every waking moment. Eva listened, her hands still, her gaze open and unflinching. She didn't cry for him. She understood that his grief, like hers, was too deep for tears. When the stars came out, bright and cold in the clear desert sky, she reached across the space between them and took his hand. He didn't pull away. She found herself telling him things she had never spoken aloud to another living soul. She told him her limp wasn't from the fire, but from being thrown from a wild horse when she was just a girl. She told him about the scar on her cheek, how her husband had once traced it with his finger and said it made her look wild, like something beautiful and unbreakable. She told him about the day they found his body, about the sheriff's casual dismissal, about the justice that never came. "We make a hell of a pair," Caleb said one night, his voice a low rumble. She nodded, her fingers still intertwined with his. Two ghosts trying to build a new life. "Think we can do it?" he asked. She looked around her, at the sturdy new fence, at the strong walls of the rebuilt barn, at Dusty grazing peacefully in the corral, at the rocking chair he had repaired on her porch. "I think," she said softly, "we already are." Then the letter came. It was just a scrap of paper, folded and torn, shoved under her door sometime in the dead of night. One word was scrawled across it in a shaky, desperate hand. "Run." No signature. No explanation. But the meaning was as clear and cold as a grave. Someone knew. Someone remembered who Caleb used to be, and they were no longer content to wait in the saloon. They were coming for him, and they would tear down everything she had just started to rebuild to get to him. She found him by the creek, mending a broken saddle strap, his movements slow and deliberate. She held out the crumpled piece of paper without a word. His eyes scanned the single terrifying word. He read it once, then again. A muscle twitched in his jaw. He folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his coat pocket. "They found me," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "No," she replied, her own voice sharp with a fire he hadn't heard before. "They found us." He looked at her then, a long, searching look. "You don't have to stay, Eva. You didn't ask for any of this. I can ride out, lead them away from here." She took a step closer, her eyes blazing. The broken, timid widow was gone. In her place stood a woman forged in grief and hardened by injustice. "You think I'm afraid of men who kill in the dark?" she said, her voice low and dangerous. "I have already buried one love in this cursed ground. I will not bury another." His breath caught in his throat. He hadn't realized. He wasn't sure she had either, until the words were out, hanging in the air between them like a vow. It wasn't just an alliance of convenience anymore. It was something more, something fierce and unbreakable. That evening, they rode into town together. There was no hiding in the shadows, no silent retreat. Ava walked straight through the swinging doors of the saloon, the men inside falling silent as she passed. She placed her heavy hunting rifle on a poker table with a solid thud that echoed in the sudden quiet. It was a declaration. Caleb followed a moment later, his presence filling the doorway. He moved with a calm, deadly grace, his eyes sweeping the room. Sheriff Toiver, who had been nursing a whiskey at the bar, stood up slowly, his hand instinctively brushing against the butt of his pistol. Eva stared the sheriff down, her gaze like ice. "We're not here to cause trouble, Sheriff," she said, her voice ringing with newfound authority. "But we've been warned that trouble is coming, and we won't be facing it alone this time." Caleb stepped up beside her, a solid wall of resolve. "You still think the law matters in this town?" he asked Toiver, his voice a low challenge. "Then prove it." Sheriff Toiver looked from Eva's determined face to Caleb's unyielding stare. He saw two broken things that had somehow reforged themselves into something strong, something dangerous. The fear was still in his eyes, but it was mixed with something else now, a flicker of grudging respect. After a long, tense moment, he gave a single sharp nod. The next few days were a blur of frantic preparation. Ava sharpened every knife she owned, her movements precise and methodical. Caleb cleaned their rifles, his hands moving with an expert familiarity that spoke of 1,000 battles fought and won. He taught her things she never knew, how to load faster, how to aim for the heart, how to breathe through the fear. They turned her small farmhouse into a fortress. They set lanterns around the barn, creating pools of light in the darkness. They lined the top of the new fence with shards of broken glass. The townsfolk watched from behind their curtains, their faces pale with a mixture of terror and fascination. No one offered to help. But for the first time, no one stood in their way either. Sometimes, that was the most you could ask for. On the fourth night, as dark, bruised clouds gathered over the hills, they stood on the porch together, watching the wind whip through the dry grass. The air was electric, charged with the impending storm. She turned to him, her face serious in the fading light. "If we survive this," she said, "I want to turn the barn into a real stable. I want to raise mustangs." He looked at her as if she had just handed him the sun. A slow smile spread across his face. "In that case," he said, "I'll build you a gate that never closes." She took his hand, her fingers lacing through his. His hand was rough, solid, and warm. "We can't outrun our pasts, can we?" she whispered. "No," he agreed, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "But maybe, just maybe, we can outlive them." The storm hadn't broken yet, but the thunder was already rolling in their hearts, and when the lightning finally struck, they would be ready. They would face it together. The preparations were nearly complete. Every window was boarded, every angle covered. But as Caleb moved through the twilight, checking their defenses one last time, a detail snagged his attention. It was something small, something he should have noticed days ago. Sheriff Toiver's horse, a big roan, was tied to the hitching post outside his office. On its flank was a brand. A small, simple design of a snake eating its own tail. Caleb froze. The blood in his veins turned to ice. He had seen that brand before, a long time ago, in a different life. It was the mark of the Culebra gang, a ruthless outfit he had tangled with back when he wore a marshal's badge. They were vicious, cunning, and they had a network that ran deeper than anyone knew. He had always assumed Toiver was just a weak, incompetent lawman, afraid of his own shadow. But that brand told a different story. The sheriff wasn't scared of the riders who had taken over his town. He was one of them, or worse. He found Ava in the barn, loading shells into the shotgun. He didn't waste words. "Toiver," he said, his voice grim. "He's with them, the brand on his horse. It belongs to the gang." Ava stopped what she was doing, the brass shell slipping from her fingers and falling silently into the hay. The implications of his words crashed down on her like a physical blow. The sheriff, the one man who was supposed to represent the law, to offer some semblance of protection, was part of the very evil that had haunted her life for 3 years. It explained everything: his dismissal of her husband's murder, his attempts to keep her isolated, his fear. It wasn't fear of the riders, it was fear of being exposed. They were utterly, completely alone. The riders weren't just passing through to settle a score with Caleb. They were here on business. Business with the sheriff. But what business? What could possibly be in a forgotten place like Dry Creek that was worth this much blood and risk? Ava's gaze drifted from Caleb's face to the dark, oppressive silhouette of the barn. Her mind raced back to that terrible night. The fire, the smell of smoke and fear. Her husband. He hadn't been himself for weeks leading up to it. He was jumpy, secretive. He spent hours digging in the barn late at night when he thought she was asleep. He had told her he'd found something that would change their lives forever, that would get them out of this dusty hellhole for good. He was supposed to be meeting someone that night. The night he died. "The fire," she whispered, her eyes wide with a horrifying new understanding. It wasn't an accident. He wasn't just a victim. She looked at Caleb, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. He was part of it. Caleb's eyes narrowed. The locket. It wasn't just a random trophy taken by a low-life robber. It was a message. It was a claim. "What did he find, Eva?" Caleb asked, his voice low and urgent. She didn't know. But she knew where he had been digging. Suddenly, the strange actions of the town made a terrible kind of sense. The cruelty, the whispers, the shunning. It wasn't just small-town prejudice. It was a calculated campaign. Someone wanted her gone. Someone wanted her scared enough to abandon her land, to leave behind whatever secret her husband had unearthed. They needed to know who was pulling the strings. It was bigger than the riders, bigger even than the corrupt sheriff. Their eyes turned, as if drawn by an invisible string, toward the one other center of power in Dry Creek. The church, the preacher, a man who spoke of peace and salvation, but whose eyes always seemed to be watching, calculating. Caleb's mind flashed back to his martial days. He remembered whispers, rumors of a shadowy figure who financed the Culebra gang, a mastermind who laundered their stolen money and directed their operations from a position of unimpeachable authority. The gang had a code name for him, a man they feared and respected in equal measure. They called him the Shepherd. Caleb and Eva stared at each other across the dimly lit barn, the full, monstrous truth settling over them. The entire town was a lie, a carefully constructed stage for a play of greed and murder. And they were standing right in the middle of it. The storm was no longer coming. They were already in its eye. The plan had to change. This wasn't a simple siege anymore. It was a chess match against a hidden king. They couldn't just fight the riders. They had to expose the entire conspiracy. They had to turn the hunters against each other. "They want what's under this barn," Eva said, her voice a low, determined hum. "So we'll use it as bait." She took a piece of paper and a nub of charcoal. Her hand was steady as she wrote a short, cryptic note. A fake confession. It said she knew what her husband had buried, that she had found a buyer, and that she was meeting them at midnight to make the exchange. It was a lie designed to incite panic, to force the shepherd out of the shadows. Under the cover of darkness, Caleb slipped into town, a ghost in the silent streets. He pinned the note to the sheriff's office door, a place he knew Toiver would see it first thing in the morning. Then they retreated to the hayloft of the barn, their rifles resting on the ledge, their eyes fixed on the town. They didn't have to wait long. As the sun's first rays painted the sky, they saw Sheriff Toiver emerge from his office. He saw the note, tore it down, and read it. Even from a distance, they could see the panic in his posture. He didn't saddle up to ride to the farm. He ran. He ran straight for the church. The trap was sprung. Caleb and Eva slipped out of the barn and crept through the pre-dawn gloom, hugging the shadows of the buildings until they reached the tall, stained-glass windows of the church. They pressed their ears to the cold glass, listening. "She knows!" Toiver's voice was a panicked hiss inside. "She knows about the gold. She's selling it." Then another voice, calm, cold, and utterly terrifying in its serenity. The preacher. "Peace, Brother Toiver. The Lord provides. If the widow has become a problem, then the Lord simply requires another sacrifice." The conversation that followed laid the entire ugly truth bare. A fortune in stolen Union Army gold, hijacked by the Culebra gang, was buried right under Eva's barn. Her husband, a low-level member of the gang, had been tasked with hiding it, but he'd gotten greedy and tried to double-cross them. The preacher, the shepherd himself, had ordered his death. The sheriff had carried it out. The fire was to cover their tracks. They had orchestrated the town's 3-year campaign of hatred against Eva, cultivating her isolation, all in the hopes that she would eventually break and leave her land, abandoning the treasure buried beneath it. The locket, planted by the sheriff on her gate, was a cruel piece of psychological warfare, a tool to keep her terrified and off balance. Eva felt a wave of nausea. Her entire life for the past 3 years, her grief, her shame, her loneliness, it had all been a lie, a carefully managed illusion. The riders would be coming soon, expecting to find Eva and Caleb at the farm. But their true enemies were right here, in the house of God. "The law in this town is a lie," Caleb whispered, his hand tightening on his rifle. "Tonight, we deliver justice." They didn't wait for the riders. They moved to the heavy front doors of the church and slammed a thick wooden beam across them, barring them from the outside. Caleb picked up a fallen torch from a sconce by the door. He lit it, the flames casting his face in a demonic glow. "Confess your sins!" His voice boomed through the church, the voice of an avenging angel. "Judgment has come to Dry Creek." Panic erupted inside. The holy man and the lawman, the shepherds of this corrupted flock, were trapped in their own hallowed ground. The first gunshot from inside the church was a signal. The trapped wolves were trying to claw their way out. The riders, camped just outside of town, would have heard it. They would be coming. Chaos was their only ally now. Caleb and Eva took up positions across the street, using the blacksmith's forge for cover. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about cleansing. It was about burning the rot out of Dry Creek, once and for all. Just as they predicted, hoofbeats thundered down the main street. The 5 riders galloped into view, their guns drawn, their faces grim. They saw the barricaded church and the smoke beginning to curl from a shattered window where the preacher was trying to return fire. They were confused. Their allies, the sheriff and the preacher, were under siege. But by whom? One of the riders spotted Caleb's shadow moving behind the forge and opened fire. The battle began. It was a maelstrom of noise and violence, a 3-way war fought in the single crooked street of the town. Bullets splintered wood and ricocheted off stone. The riders, caught between the fire from the church and the unseen assailants in the street, were thrown into disarray. Caleb moved with a deadly efficiency, a ghost of the marshal he once was. He took down one rider, then another. But in the chaos, one of them got the drop on him. The rider emerged from the alley beside the general store, his pistol leveled directly at Caleb's back. Caleb was exposed, trapped. It was over. A single shot rang out, sharp and clear above the din. The rider crumpled to the ground, a neat dark hole in his forehead. But the shot hadn't come from Caleb's rifle. He spun around, his eyes searching. He saw her. Ava. She was perched on the roof of the livery stable, her hunting rifle pressed to her shoulder. But she wasn't the trembling, uncertain woman he had taught to shoot. She was a completely different person. She moved with a calm, lethal confidence he had never seen before. She reloaded the rifle with a fluid, practiced motion that spoke of years of experience. And as she stood up to take aim at another rider, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Her limp was gone. She moved across the rooftop with a cat-like grace, her body balanced and sure. The stiff, dragging leg that had defined her for 3 years had vanished. Caleb stared, his mind reeling. The limp, he breathed, the words lost in the gunfire. The scar. She must have felt his eyes on her. She glanced down at him from her perch, and in the flickering light of the now burning church, he saw her face. The mask of the broken, grieving widow was gone. In its place was a face of hard, polished steel. Her eyes were not the eyes of a victim. They were the eyes of a predator. "You think I survived 3 years in this town by being a victim?" Her voice cut through the chaos, clear and cold as a winter wind. "My husband didn't just find that gold, Caleb. He stole it, and I helped him do it. The preacher, the sheriff, the riders, they were our partners before they turned on us and killed him." The world tilted on its axis. Caleb felt the ground give way beneath him. The woman he had risked everything to protect, the fragile soul he had seen himself in, was a lie. All of it. The helplessness, the fear, the shared grief. It was all an act, a brilliant, flawless 3-year performance. "I wasn't waiting for justice, Caleb," she called down to him, a grim smile touching her lips as she aimed her rifle again. "I was waiting for a weapon, and then you arrived." The revelation hit Caleb with the force of a physical blow. He was a pawn, a tool, a weapon she had waited patiently to pick up and aim at her enemies. Every shared moment, every quiet conversation on the porch, every brick they'd laid together, had it all been a calculated move in her long and bloody game of revenge? The battle raged on, but for Caleb, the world had gone silent. He watched her on the rooftop, a queen surveying her victory, and felt a profound, bottomless betrayal. The church was now fully engulfed in flames, a funeral pyre for the town's corrupt soul. The preacher and the sheriff were gone, consumed by the fire they had started 3 years ago. The last of the riders fell under Ava's relentless, expert fire. And then it was over. Silence descended, broken only by the crackling of the flames and the sighing of the wind. In the eerie light of the dawn, surrounded by the bodies of their enemies, it was just the two of them. Caleb, the broken marshal, and Ava, the mastermind. He looked up at her, his voice rough with pain. So all of it was a lie? She climbed down from the roof, her movements fluid and sure. The limp was a distant memory. She walked toward him through the ash and smoke, her rifle held loosely in one hand. She stopped just before him, her face smudged with soot, her eyes holding his. "No," she said, and for the first time her voice was stripped of its icy control. It was soft, and it held a note of something that sounded terrifyingly like sincerity. The part about burying one love and not wanting to bury another, that was the truest thing I've ever said. Before he could process her words, the townsfolk began to emerge from their homes, their faces pale and horrified. They saw the burning church, the dead riders, the body of their sheriff lying in the street. And they saw Eva and Caleb standing together in the center of the devastation. They didn't know the whole story. They only knew that the long nightmare of Dry Creek was finally over. Ava ignored them. She walked straight to the rebuilt barn, the one they had raised from the ashes together. She knelt, pried up a floorboard they had laid side by side, and reached into the dark space beneath. When her hand emerged, it was holding a heavy leather satchel. She opened it. It was filled with the dull, heavy gleam of gold bars, the treasure that had cost so many lives. She looked at Caleb, her expression unreadable. "Half of it is yours," she said, her voice even. "It's a new life. You can go anywhere you want, be anyone you want." He looked at the gold, the fortune that could buy him anything he desired. He could disappear, start over, leave the ghosts of his past behind for good. He could leave her behind. He looked at her face, at the woman who had deceived him, used him, and manipulated him. But he also saw the woman who had fought beside him, the woman whose quiet strength had reignited something in his own broken soul. She had lied about who she was, but she had never lied about what she wanted, to burn down the world that had wronged her. And in that, he saw a reflection of his own dark heart. He was her weapon, yes, but she was his reason. Slowly, he shook his head. "I don't want the gold," he said, his voice quiet but firm. He closed the distance between them, walking past the fortune at her feet. He reached out and gently, so gently, touched the scar on her cheek. "I think we already have a life," he whispered. "Right here." A single tear, the first she had shed in 3 years, traced a clean path through the soot on her cheek. They buried the gold back under the barn, a dark secret to anchor their new future. The town, free of its corrupt shepherds, began the slow, painful process of healing. The townsfolk looked at Eva differently now, not with pity or fear, but with a quiet, bewildered awe. They built her stable. They bought the Mustangs. They never spoke of her long game or his past again. They didn't need to. They had seen the absolute worst in each other and had chosen to stay, to build, to love. Years passed. The legend of that fiery dawn grew with each telling, though no one ever knew the whole truth. They had a daughter, a little girl with her mother's fierce eyes and her father's quiet strength. They named her Lark. One day when she was older, she asked her mother about the single scorched beam on the barn that they had never replaced. Ava smiled, pulling her daughter into a hug. "That's a reminder, baby," she said, kissing her forehead. It's a reminder that sometimes you have to burn everything down to build something true. On the porch, in the two rocking chairs, Ava and Caleb would sit in the evenings, old and gray, their hands intertwined. They had found their home, not in a place, but in the shared, unspoken truth of their violent pasts. She was never a curse. He was never just a lawman. They were survivors who had fought their way through hell and found their own twisted piece of heaven on the other side. They say the West was won with bullets and blood, but sometimes the fiercest battles are fought in the silence of a broken heart. And sometimes the greatest treasures aren't gold, but the promise of a new dawn. If this story of lies, revenge, and the brutal path to redemption kept you guessing until the very end, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss the dark tales we have lurking just over the next ridge. And let us know in the comments, when did you first suspect Eva wasn't who she seemed? We read every single one,